Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and Hunter's with me here today. Hunter, thanks for being here.
Autumn, thanks for coming back, and I'm surprised you knew how to do that.
I do feel a little rusty, honestly.
For our listeners to know, this is Autumn's first episode back from her sabbatical.
Yes.
Now, it did not appear that you were on sabbatical to podcast listeners because you magically appeared through the gift of technology. We artificially created your voice, and we made it say what we wanted it to say, and we did podcast. Jesse's really he's really up to speed on the AI.
That's great. Actually, if Jesse is up to speed on the AI, that's going to make my job going forward here a lot easier. No, I discovered this, though, because of some texts I received. So what we did was, on the podcast, we took a summer break, and we did not release podcast episodes during those weeks. I went out on sabbatical the last week of July, and then in September, we began releasing episodes again. We had pre-recorded those episodes before I was out in July, but I started getting a few texts while I was on sabbatical that said, "Hey, thanks so much for coming in still to record the podcast." And I thought, what? I'm not. Oh, yes. We're still releasing episodes in September.
The pre-recorded episodes have finally dropped.
Yes.
And you were live. So thanks for doing that.
People could still hear my voice, take me with them, assume I had come in to record. But I appreciate the texts because it means that people were listening.
That's right.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. Thanks for shooting me a note. They were very well intentioned, and I do appreciate them. It just took me a moment to figure out what people were referencing. So today we're actually back. I'm back.
We are actually back, and we are switching roles a little bit, although you did not let me do the introduction, but we're switching roles a little bit in that I am going to interview you. Often when you and I record episodes, you ask me questions, and in fact, as I listen to those episodes, I think sometimes I'm talking too much. I need more of Autumn on here. So we are going to listen primarily to you today, and I'm going to ask you questions about your sabbatical. And I think this is really interesting. I have a friend who does a podcast regularly for his church, and when one of the pastors goes on sabbatical, they always bring them back and interview them on the podcast about what they learned on sabbatical. And I actually got to sit down with you a couple of days ago and just debrief how was sabbatical and what did God give you in that time and space? Are there things you learned, reflections you had? And I found it so valuable and so helpful to me because I haven't been on sabbatical. I've been in the midst of work, and often the perspective you get from getting a little bit of distance and some rest allows you to have some perspective on work and on your life that you just don't get in the hustle and bustle of every day. And that's not just a gift to you, that can be a gift to everyone else. And so I said, I think we should interview you about this on the podcast. So thanks for being the guest today.
Yes, certainly. Although I'm glad we'll go back to our typical roles in the next episode.
Okay, I think the first question is just explain what sabbatical is for our listeners. You had 3 months of sabbatical, and this is a common habit in ministry environments. To about every 7 years, that's what Sabbath. It's basically the word Sabbath, to give ministry workers some space away from the daily grind of ministry in order to reflect. And it's not just an extended vacation. It's meant to be kind of a time of reflection. And there's probably a lot of our listeners who think, geez, that would be really nice to have it in my job. Why is that a perk of ministry? But explain to us what sabbatical is and how you utilized, in a big way, how you utilized that time.
Yeah, sabbatical is really a time away from work, away from the environment of work and the weight of work, the intensity of work, to rest and to be renewed. So within ministry particularly, the hope is that there's time to connect with God in a deeper way that perhaps allows for more reflection. But the metaphor that I really love, that I think is true of sabbatical, is that of the year of Sabbath. You already mentioned this, but within an agricultural mindset, in the rhythms written into the law and habits of Israel that God gave them, the year of Sabbath was to let the land rest. But the purpose of Sabbath was that the land would rest so that it could heal and bring about greater fertility in the future. So produce more in the future. So the resting was also a time of renewing. Mm-hmm. And even though the work wasn't obvious, there was nothing going on, the crops weren't being planted, the field wasn't being worked, as it were, the ability to give that land rest then also produced in it a greater ability to continue to produce in the future. And I think that's the picture of Sabbath.
And I like that you're bringing that out because it points to the fact that Sabbath is a time that if it's used well, and sabbatical, if it's used well, should invigorate your work in a way that you wouldn't be able to do if you were just kind of not taking that time in that space. And so it has a purpose related to your work. It's different than your normal work rhythms, but the purpose is to invigorate your work. And so what I wanted to do today is just kind of ask you some questions in terms of how it helped you do that and what some of the themes were that of what you learned on sabbatical. And I know as you talk about that, I'm sure you'll also weave in a little bit of what you were actually doing during this time. So one of the themes you identified is that you had some fresh reflections on the nature of work itself as a result of what you did on sabbatical. So tell us about what you did that opened that up for you and what you learned.
Mm-hmm. It's true. One of the primary places that my mind returned to was about the nature of work. And a bit about me is that I grew up in an agricultural setting in a tiny town in southeastern Colorado. The majority of the economy out where I grew up is agricultural, so ranching and farming.
When people think southeastern Colorado, they need to think flat.
Yes.
Right? Don't
prairie.
Think mountains. Think prairies. Think
it's the
other Colorado that most of you have never gone to.
Correct. Yeah. The part of the state no one comes to see.
By the way, my family is counting on your family for our Thanksgiving turkey this year, so we better get that.
That's right. Yes. You will get it. I'm going to help butcher this turkey.
Fantastic.
Shortly. So I grew up in this setting, and work is woven into life. Work and life are almost synonymous in the community in which I grew up. The work of farming is immersive. So typically you live there. Farmers, ranchers live where their work is, and they work long hours. They also rest well. But there's so many aspects of work and good work that I appreciated growing up, but didn't really reflect on. It was simply what was and what I knew. And as I got older, I participated in much of this work. So I got to help with various aspects of farm life and work, and it shaped much of who I am. But through that, I really gained a deep appreciation for work, for the land and for work and for the work of agriculture. And this is one reason Hunter always likes to point this out / give me a hard time about it. But I always, in my favorite reads of the year, list a book that is written by a farmer or about an agrarian way of life. And so you guessed it, I read some of that on my sabbatical too. Read another Wendell Berry book.
Just what your soul needed.
It is actually just what my soul needed. So I have a long, deep appreciation about work from my childhood. And on sabbatical, one of my specific goals was to be outside a lot. I did that in various ways. I rode my bike. I took lots of walks. I took lots of walks while I listened to scripture. And I worked in my garden a lot. We have a big yard. I grow a big garden. And so I was outside working in my garden a lot. And that really, riding my bike, walking, and working in my garden was the environment in which these meditations and thoughts grew. as I was on sabbatical. So while I was working in my garden, I was also thinking deeply about work and the nature of work. And one aspect of work that I kept coming back to and that often resurfaced in my meditations was this thought, that work is participating with God in repetition of this pattern that underlies creation. And that is bringing order out of disorder, or bringing order to a place where otherwise there would be chaos. And I think we see that in the first few chapters of the Bible, but particularly in the first few verses even of Genesis, that there was a nothingness, an area of wilderness or chaos, and God brought it into ordered being. And then when he invited the people to continue working alongside him and doing this work of stewarding the natural world that he had ordered and created, it was in repeating that pattern, bringing about order out of disorder, or order out of what would otherwise be chaos. So this was a repeated theme about the nature of work in my musings while I was gardening.
I've often heard it described, I think I've preached, that work is cultivation, because the primordial kind of work God gave Adam and Eve to do was tending to a garden, and that's a cultivating work. There's a freshness when you say it's bringing order out of chaos. That's what cultivation is. Cultivating a garden is literally turning a chaotic piece of earth into a ordered piece of earth in which life can flourish. And so it's not so ordered that you engineer the life out of it, but it is ordered enough that life can grow and life can flourish. And there's something that lands fresh when you say it's bringing order out of disorder. That is what good constructive work is. You know, fascinatingly, a couple of weeks ago, I started reading a new book by Andrew Wilson called Remaking the World. And he's talking about in this book how we got to the modern world that we live in. And one of the fascinating bits of history that he weaves in is that the industrial world had to emerge from societies that were already very advanced in their agricultural work, because even agriculture is a kind of cultivation of the natural world that's far beyond where a lot of primitive societies were. And so we can sometimes think like, man, we live in cities and we do indoor office kind of work with our computers and with our brains, and then there's this whole agricultural world like you grew up in, and those two are far, far, far apart. And yet, actually, historically, the one emerged from the other. And so there's a lot we can learn about work from going back to our agricultural roots. And I just had that fresh realization just in some of the reading and thinking I've been doing lately. So I'm excited to hear that you did that. Okay, you mentioned this Wendell Berry book. It's what's it called?
It's called The Art of Loading Brush.
Okay, and loading brush doesn't mean like loading a paintbrush with paint. It means like loading
branches and limbs that maybe have fallen down or been trimmed away.
I was thinking about loading hay into the back of a truck, but that's not what he means either.
No.
Okay.
Although the principles would apply. Would apply. So part of what I was thinking about in this ordering, in my contemplation about order and how all good work is participation in this repeated pattern, another wonderful word for it is what you used, Hunter, cultivation. And so much of the work that we do, the good work that we do, fits within this paradigm. So I thought about it in this way, that one form of the good work that we do, because as you mentioned, work looks many different ways. I really resonate with agricultural metaphors, and so much of the symbolism and metaphor used in Scripture refers to the natural world or to the practice of farming or agriculture. So I appreciate that deeply, both because of my roots, my childhood, and also because I think it is true that it does help us understand the order of creation, the natural world, and God's good design into which we then fit. So I thought there's this principle in creation that speaks to this, the ordering of what would otherwise be disordered. And that is this creation of spaces that are fitted to or fitting for all forms of life in God's good creation. So this is illustrated again for us in the creation account. We see it displayed in this way. God created the heavens and the earth, and then he put creatures or beings, entities in each of those realms fitted for them. So he put great lights in the heavens. Those are entities, beings, life in some form that are fitted for the domain in which they live. He put sea or water creatures in the water. He put winged creatures in the sky. He put land creatures on the dry ground. So part of this ordering and bringing about order is creating spaces and environments in which all of God's creatures, all forms of life can flourish. That's the work of gardening too. You mentioned that a moment ago. It's taking this patch of ground and putting plants or seeds into their places in which you hope they'll grow and produce fruit. So it repeats that pattern. And so in the biblical imagination, in the creation account, creatures in each of these realms that were fitted to that space, they could graciously accept their place in that natural created order, and that is a following of God's expressed will via his design, or they could exert their own will. And if they exerted their own will, then instead of becoming agents of creation and bringing about order, they became agents instead of disorder and sowing discord. And it was the opposite of good creative work that participated with God in the ordering of things that he instituted and that we continue in. And so we can see this in various ways. We could think of this destruction rather than creation as like distorting truth or rejecting the image that God gave us and instead making ourselves into a different image or becoming distorted through this disorder and being agents of destruction and disorder instead of agents of creation. And we see the converse of what I described before in Scripture also. So God created beings fitted for each of the realms. He created the great lights for the heavens. But in many places in Scripture, we see those great lights compared to rulers who were taking glory for themselves. So they were exerting their own will.
Stars represent
kings. Exactly.
And fallen stars represent kings who have rebelled against God.
Kings or angels who have rebelled against God. And so they've, instead of accepting the place and participating in God's created order, they elevate themselves and exert their own will, and in doing so become agents of disorder. So the stars are compared then, like you said, to these rulers who become agents of chaos. And then in many instances in the prophets, it talks about them being thrown down.
Thrown down, right.
Yeah, or cast down.
There's biblical imagery, Jesus used this, of stars falling from the sky, and it's often in apocalyptic literature, like the stars. And we read that and we think like, oh, is the solar system going to collapse? That could be what it means, but it seems that this is imagery in Scripture for kingdoms and rulers collapsing.
Yes.
And so it's like political upheaval that's happening. It is fascinating how much ancient imagery, even modern nation states, incorporate into their iconography. So the American flag has 50 stars representing the 50 states. China uses stars, and they use a dragon, which
is another one of these images.
That's another one of those images. They use a dragon to represent themselves, which, I don't think that's a great idea from when I read Revelation.
The course of the Bible the biblical narrative seems to indicate.
Discourage identifying yourself as a dragon.
Yeah. That's another, though, what you're pointing out there about the use of the dragon. This is another just, it's the opposite of creatures graciously accepting where God has wisely placed them in his design and in his created order. So just another example is creatures of the land. One of those that becomes repeatedly in the biblical imagination, and this is symbolic, but becomes repeatedly in the biblical imagination, an agent of disorder or chaos is the serpent. So a snake or serpent. And so, for instance, we see this in Genesis 3, that motif is continued. So Jeremiah compares both Egypt and Nebuchadnezzar, so the nation of Egypt and the nation of Babylon, to snakes. There's I'll pull out a part of this verse. It says, Egypt will hiss like a fleeing serpent as the enemy advances in force. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has devoured us. He has thrown us into confusion, disorder. He has made us an empty jar. Like a serpent, he has swallowed us and filled his stomach with our delicacies and then spewed us out. So a creature created within God's created order that instead elevated itself, and instead of asking what its place was, chose rather to follow its own will, then becomes symbolic of all sorts of disorder, both at an individual level and, as you mentioned just a moment ago with the stars, at a nation-state level as well. And this is true of sea serpents. So I won't belabor this point anymore, but the point is that there are very real, vivid images through the whole of the Bible about people who chose to participate with God in this good work of creation and bringing about order, continuing in this pattern instilled in creation. And God wanted the whole nation of Israel to do that with him, to be images of this, making spaces fitted for more flourishing, participating in good creative work within the order that God made. And instead, when they refused to, both individuals and nations, they became depicted in this way as agents of disorder. And so we can see that in a small way in many real life examples, and in a really big way. You mentioned the nation of China. We can see this still in the way that nation states interact with each other and bring about either confusion and chaos and disorder, or maybe flounderingly attempt to bring about order and creation.
And you learned all of this from working in your garden, having prayer walks, and reading a Wendell Berry book. And now you have come back. I think where this kind of ties in to your present work is you've come back to Fellowship Denver to be an agent of cultivation rather than what you were before your sabbatical, which was a serpent of destruction. Is that what this means?
That was not what I had thought of. Yeah, but I do hope the first part of that sentiment is true. That I've come back to bring about, to create spaces in which people can carry on this good creative work and experience a depth of meaning, both in life and in work, that is, I think, what we talk about when we say we want to find fulfillment.
One of my own shortcomings as a leader, and one of the ways that I am an agent of destruction, is that I joke too much and use too much sarcasm and not enough encouragement. And so you embody this, like you cultivate space for other people to thrive. And you've done that in so many ways in the life of our church. You did that by starting and cultivating a really robust children and families ministry. And then you started an internship program, and then you started a podcast. And so like you've done this over and over again. And I think a second theme that you identified, which I think is actually significant for you and where you are in your work life and history, and given your track record that I just named, is you had some reflections on your own leadership and growth in leadership and where you want to go next in your leadership. And one of the gifts of taking some time away and taking 3 months away is the stuff that you were doing beforehand gets absorbed, and we learn how to live without you. It's hard, but we learn how to live without you. And when you come back, you don't necessarily have to immediately pick back up everything you were doing. It's a wonderful opportunity to ask, what should I be picking back up? What should I never pick back up again? What new things should I be considering and thinking about? And you've kind of earned the right to do that because of your track record. Mm-hmm. There's a sense in which in our careers, we start off in our work life and we just do whatever we are allowed to do. And I say this to folks who are just starting their careers a lot. If you have an opportunity, man, take that opportunity, sign up for it. If you'll raise your hand and sign up for every opportunity that comes along to you, like that's how you grow and how you develop. And then if you do that well enough, usually for a decade plus, you get to a place where you have more opportunities than you can reasonably take on. Mm-hmm. And now you have earned the right and you've kind of earned the privilege of asking, what do I do best? Mm-hmm. And you're kind of in that place in your career. So I'm curious how you've reflected on that. I know you have reflected on that during your sabbatical and what you're imagining.
Yeah. Well, one central aspect of that is that I appreciate that what you have shared under that there has been a lot of hard work and commitment that has gone into it, but none of this is done without the support of a team in a church. So I absolutely would not have the longevity that I've had at Fellowship, the opportunities that I've had, without the support and love of a church family and a staff team alongside who all this takes place within those contexts. So the context is incredibly important. And it also wouldn't take place without having had the ability to grow our staff team. Children's ministry, children and family ministry, requires a bunch of administration, as do most programs and organizations. And so the fact that we've been able to increase our staff team and add some folks working alongside me directly in children and family ministries has also freed me up to think more about what it means to be a leader at this juncture of sort of work at Fellowship within the context of Fellowship. So thank you to our church family for enabling us to do that, and to our staff team for continually encouraging me, and to our elders and to you and our pastoral team for continually giving me opportunities to step into these various areas of leadership. I think that attached to my reflections on work, what it is to participate with God in this good work of creation, this is the work of new creation as well. The work of new creation follows this pattern, this order out of disorder in this way. The work of the gospel and of the Spirit is that of a reordering of affections and desires. So when someone is encountered with the gospel, believes and knows that sin is reigning in their lives, accepts the work of Jesus on their behalf, and receives the Spirit, the result is new creation, a reordering of affections and desires. And in my time at Fellowship recently, pre-sabbatical, you and I have processed quite a bit what's going on around us in our culture, in our city, and I see so much confusion and disorder and striving and attempting to find fulfillment or life or moral goodness in so many things. And I see so many of those things falling short of doing that for people. And so Sabbatical had allowed me to reflect on these themes and to say, I just really want to do more of that work. Yeah. This was a central question in our recent sermon series too. What does it mean to live at the intersection of heaven and earth? And so I've thought a lot, obviously, in my ruminations on work about this aspect of heaven and earth and what it does mean to sit at the intersection of the two. And this, we talked in our sermon series about discipleship, creating space for people to meet Jesus. And the work of children and family ministry is that, creating space for our kids to know and come to love Jesus, to see that love displayed through the people who are investing in them, and in families to encourage them to take next steps of discipleship, both in their homes and within the context of the greater Christian community. And I think that brings about order and invites people into this good community and work that allows for more creative works and potential. And that's really what I want to do. So in asking, then what does that mean for me? Well, I hope that it means that these people we have hired through the giving of the church and through our consistent, faithful work here in the city of Denver will allow me to step out of some of the administrative tasks that had been doing pre-sabbatical, to hand those off to other capable staff who we now have hired, and to be able to do a little more thinking and leading in this way. What does it mean to create environments fitted to the people who God has brought here contextually, and with the hope that this will invite them into this work and into this work of new creation, because I think that is where they'll find fulfillment and life.
There's a legendary entrepreneur coach named Dan Sullivan, and he's not a believer, best I can tell, but he coaches typically businessmen and women who have built businesses and watched them grow. And so they've kind of had this experience of, like, they don't come into something built, but they actually start something, and then it kind of grows with them and underneath them, and they have to navigate these changes that happen in their work as the business that they've built is leading, is growing. And in a lot of ways, that journey maps onto some of our story at Fellowship, because like I was here starting it, and my work today is very different than it was when we started it. And you didn't start this children and family ministry, but you took over it when it was very small and kind of incubation form, and you've seen it, grow to include hundreds of kids now, and it's very different today. And one of the points that he makes, in fact, I'm thinking of this because I just read a book that he released called 10X is easier than 2X or something like that. But one of the points he makes is, at these different transition points, for the ministry, in our case, to keep growing, the leader has to keep growing. And the way the leader has to grow is to step back and ask, okay, I'm doing all this stuff, but what is it that is my absolute best contribution that really moves things forward, that I do better than anyone else on my team? And then I've got to develop a team who can support me and do some of the work that's not that little bit that I do best. And that's not just because we want to give off grunt work to other people. It actually allows them an opportunity to grow too. So they get on the track of developing, and they might develop. So Sydney, for example, who works in Children at Valley Ministries, she might be a future Autumn, and she's actually doing now a lot of the work that you were doing 7 or 8 years ago. And so now she's got an opportunity to grow and develop. And now, because you've grown and developed her, you now have an opportunity to step back and say, what is the thing that I do best that contributes to this ministry flourishing and growing? And how can I do more of that? What is that work for you? Did you come to some conclusions?
One aspect of work that was not present in my day-to-day work when I started working at Fellowship is that of developing more leaders. And the theme of some of my recent work, both through the internship and then through different aspects of children's ministry in working with our volunteer team, has been that. And I have learned a lot about it. I have a lot to learn, but it's something that I'm excited about and think I do fairly well, is investing in other future leaders, current and future leaders, in a way that is without specific intent, but comes alongside them and allows them to do this work of cultivation. Hopefully gives them space to exercise that in different areas of our church, or to encourage that in whatever ministry they're currently working in. Like some people who come to our ministry foundations class on Wednesday mornings that I co-lead with Dave, they are coming from other entities in the city. So other ministries, other nonprofits, or other churches or church plants. And so we, on Wednesday mornings in our discussion and investment in them, can discuss aspects of leadership really relevant to their context, their leadership, that hopefully are transferable then and encouraging to them. And I've enjoyed this work. This is something I think I'm growing in and that God has allowed me to be good at and to gain skill in. And that's one area, one specific area of work at Fellowship that I would like to continue to pursue, investing in people within our ministry and in other leaders around the city and helping them grow.
Taking that time to invest in people is demanding. It takes a lot of energy. And so the point is you have to get some things off of your plate so you can fully give yourself to that. And it sounds like that's what you're doing is you're developing your team. So I'm encouraged that the sabbatical served that purpose. Yeah. Well, the sabbatical did serve that purpose because it asked your team to step up and do some of that stuff so that when you come back, you don't have to pick it all back up, but you're able now to repurpose a lot of your time and energy toward developing people and coaching people and leading, which is a gift to our church. Okay, last theme you had here was you got to spend more time with your family and particularly your kids in this season of life than maybe you can, or different kind of time than you can when you're just in the normal hustle and bustle of the weekly work rhythms, right? So describe that for us and what that was like.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a strong dose of reality in sabbatical too, when you're also a mom of 3 kids. So some questions that I got, so well-intentioned, I am not offended by them in the least, but sort of had this air about them that the subtext was that I just must have had so much time to do whatever it was that I felt like doing. And my mind went to really so much of what I was doing was cleaning my house, making sure I did all the administrative tasks associated with running a household. And fall is a busy season for kids at school too. My oldest plays volleyball. My middle kiddo played soccer. And so there's so much work attached to all of those things, just enabling them to participate in them. So the beauty of sabbatical was that I could focus on that in a way that I can't always when I am carrying the load of work and home and administrative tasks. So the theme of much of my sabbatical and really what was central to my time with my family was being present in each day and time, a little bit of margin. What sabbatical afforded me that was different was that I had more margin so I could linger over things with my kids without feeling the pressure of needing to get things done or balance quite as much. So first of all, still a lot of work. I was reminded that being a full-time mom is plenty to occupy whatever time you have. It will fill it. So that was a reminder. But the second reminder was that there's so many good gifts from God that are evident to us in day-to-day life. And some of those are through, my husband Jason is a really wonderful partner. And I said I had to do the administrative tasks. I willingly took on more of that while I was on sabbatical because we share all of that together. I work, he works. And so the reality of our lives is that it has to be this sort of companionship and partnership. And it is. And he's a wonderful husband and father. So during sabbatical, I could also just give my family the gift of being present more and making sure that those things were attended to well. And so that was my hope in enjoying and noticing, actively noticing the good gifts present in each day in our family life. That margin afforded me the ability to linger over conversations or to play a game when otherwise I would have maybe felt like I needed to get to the next thing, or spend more time outside throwing the football with my son, Axel. Those sorts of things were very present in our life together as a family. And then we also did get to take one big fun trip together, which was something we haven't done before. We went to Scotland. So this was the first international trip we've taken as a family, and it was just so much fun. It was definitely a highlight of my sabbatical, and we enjoyed it.
Well, out of what you are even modeling for us in your reflections from Sabbatical is the name of our podcast, Vision for Life. You are taking time and space to reflect on the direction of your life, to use your time and the gifts and the people God has given you in a way that brings life to others. And so this is like the spirit of what we do on this podcast. So I just appreciate even the work you put in to kind of summarize some of the lessons you learned for the rest of us. Now, you never told us about that Wendell book you read. Yeah. I asked you about it, and you kind of I diverted. Yeah, you kind of diverted. So yeah. I'm sure you still want to tell us what that was about.
Okay. Yes, I do have a closing encouragement for our Vision for Life listeners. One reason that I love reading Wendell Berry, well, there are a couple reasons. One is that he's interdisciplinary. So he has made a long study of history, literature, art, religion, primarily Christianity, economics, and he weaves all of these into this perspective that he shares about agrarian life and agrarian ecology in his books. The second reason that I love reading Wendell Berry is he always talks about limitations, which fits very much into this idea of God's good design. What is ordered and therefore appropriate? What is our humans' rightful but responsible place within that order? And so he actively acknowledges his own limitations, that of the created world, and always is asking what is right and appropriate for this place and this time, and what is fitting within this design, the larger design that is the design of creation and God's good design woven into creation. So I love that aspect. I love that he's interdisciplinary, that he asks this question repeatedly, like what is fitting? And what does all of this history, art, literature, economics tell us about this and about our time and place and about the natural world that we inhabit and are to steward in our time and place? So I find that aspect of reading his work so refreshing, but pertinent to my my musings and meditations on sabbatical and to this question about living at the intersection of heaven and earth. One, I'm just going to read a paragraph out of this book, The Art of Loading Brush.
Readings with Autumn.
Readings
from
with
Wendell
Autumn
Berry.
from Wendell Berry. His voice, if you listen to him do any of his own readings, which are pretty rare, his voice is very low. I'm not going to attempt to sound like Wendell Berry. So he says in this paragraph here, what I am sure of is that we have lost the old apprehension of nature as a being accessible to imagination, linking heaven and earth, making and informing the incarnate creation, and requiring of humanity an obedience at once worshipful, ethical, and economic. Her stern instruction never disproved that we humans have a rightful but responsible place in the order of things has disappeared and has been absent a long time from our working consciousness and our formal schooling. So in my meditations on all of the things I've shared here today, and in this aspect of good work that participates with God in bringing about more order, reading this book was refreshing and insightful in those questions. And this idea of growing a biblical imagination, which is central to our conversations in Vision for Life, is central to Wendell Berry's work as well. It's a strong theme in C.S. Lewis's work. It's a theme in a book that we've referenced before that our staff team read called Through New Eyes by James B. Jordan. Not Jim Jordan, different, in the news for different reasons. And
he's not going to be Speaker of the House.
No, disorder. And it's a theme in Wendell Berry's writing, a strong theme. And that is this idea of growing a biblical imagination in which the natural world, the created world, the good, ordered world that God gave us actually reveals so much to us about the spiritual world. And this idea that we talked about earlier in our podcast conversation today is central to all these images that I brought up, this growing a biblical imagination. And we do that through just asking, observing what is ordered, what is fitting. And so much of that I find in the natural world, which is why one of my goals was to be outside, to work in my garden, and why I love reading Wendell Berry. And I loved reading this book while I was on sabbatical.
Well, welcome back, Autumn. It is so good to have you back on our team. It's good to have this post sabbatical version of you back as well, and we're thrilled.
Agent of order,
agent of order and flourishing. It is in touch with her agrarian roots. Now treating us as a bunch of turkeys that she has to farm. It's good. It's good to have you back, and I'm sure our listeners are glad to have you back as well. You want to give us some closing instructions?
Nope, just keep tuning in. Next week, we'll go back to our regular roles, and I'll be asking more of the questions. Thank you, Hunter. At this juncture in our podcast, I typically say, if you have any questions based on today's episode. So I don't know if my sabbatical musings will cause any questions to arise in anyone's mind, but we always welcome your questions and especially your suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future. We received some while I was on sabbatical, and I was very excited to come back to the office this week and read some suggestions. So we'll be back with future episodes. We always love hearing from you. You can send all of that, your thoughts, questions, suggestions, to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.